by the national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as well as the federal Indian Day Schools Settlement Agreement. To continue walking the road of reconciliation, we must work with survivors, families, communities on the support they need. There's still much to be done, but yesterday's announcements are another important step along our shared path. Au cours des 2 derniers jours, over the past 2 days, we had a virtual meeting with the Council of Ministers. It was an opportunity for our team to meet up after a challenging start of the year in order to establish our priorities for the weeks and months to come. We started by talking about the pandemic and its impact on the economy. We also talked about what our government can and must do in order to fight systemic racism. I'll start with discussions regarding the pandemic. On Monday, we talked with Dr. Tam, the Chief Public Medical Health Officer of Canada, Dr. Namer, who is Chief Scientist, and Dr. Naylor, who is responsible for the Immunity Task Force on COVID-19. From the beginning, our response has been based on science and data, and that is what we're going to continue to do when we restart certain activities. This is the only way to protect Canadians and to truly put an end to COVID-19. We held a 2-day virtual cabinet retreat. We talked about how the virus is progressing across the country, as well as our response so far. Later today, we'll be releasing a public health modeling update on COVID-19 in Canada. We'll have more details then, but for now, I want to give a quick overview. Last week, we said that nationally, the number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths is declining over time. That is still the case today. The situation is stabilizing in Canada because Canadians did their part and followed public health instructions. But we still have to be very careful. Things can change quickly. As Dr. Tam will explain later, we still have some hotspots in some parts of the country, including in long-term care facilities and agricultural work settings. So as we continue to gradually reopen the economy, we have to remain vigilant. We have to keep following public health advice. La COVID-19 a provoqué non seulement une crise
COVID-19 caused a health crisis as well as an economic crisis. This is one of the themes that we touched on during the cabinet retreat. A lot of people were not able to work for weeks, and others lost their jobs. All sectors of the economy felt the consequences of COVID-19, but some were more strongly impacted than others. In order to understand the impact of COVID-19 on our economy, we're going to be publishing an economic snapshot later today. Minister Morneau will have more details to give you later, but here's what you need to remember. When the pandemic hit, a lot of people lost their jobs overnight. They did not know how they were going to feed their families or pay their bills. We were facing an unprecedented challenge, and our government had 2 choices. We could either let Canadians figure things out and hope for the best, or we could act quickly to help Canadians. And we chose to help Canadians. Today, Canada has one of the most ambitious and exhaustive plans in order to fight this pandemic. We increased financial support to vulnerable groups such as seniors and students. We offered loans to companies having liquidity issues. We helped employers rehire their employees, and we supported those who had lost their job. We're talking about 11 million Canadians that received the CERB or the wage subsidy. Our government spent so that Canadians wouldn't have to take on more debt. We did so because Canada entered into this crisis strongly. Our debt to GDP ratio was lower than other G7 countries. Our government was well placed to help Canadians, and we lay the foundation
that will allow our economy to bounce back. 4 months later, we have slowed the spread of the virus, and we are now able to reopen certain sectors of the economy. With historic low interest rates, the cost for loans is low, and our government will continue to invest in Canadians and in our economy. This restart, this recovery, will see certain sectors bounce back more quickly than others. Some people will find a job more quickly than others. When we're moving to this restart, Canadians can count on us to always be there for them.
To better understand the impacts of COVID-19 on our economy, we will be releasing a fiscal and economic snapshot this afternoon. Minister Morneau will have more to say on this later today, but for now, I want to talk about the main takeaways. When the pandemic first hit, a lot of people lost their jobs overnight. They didn't know how they were going to feed their families or pay their bills. Faced with this unprecedented challenge, our government had two options. We could sit back, let Canadians fend for themselves and hope that it would all be over soon, or we could swiftly and substantially choose to support Canadians. We chose to support Canadians. As we measure the cost of helping Canadians, we shouldn't forget that the cost of doing nothing would have been far more to both our health care and our economy. This is not and has not been a time for tightening of belts or for austerity. By building a bridge for Canadians through this crisis, we can and will build a stronger, more resilient Canada. Today, Canada has one of the most ambitious and comprehensive plans to counter the economic impacts of this pandemic. We increased financial support to vulnerable groups like seniors and students. We provided loans to businesses struggling with cash flow, helped employers rehire their employees, and supported those who had lost their jobs. In fact, nearly 11 million Canadians have been supported through the emergency wage subsidy or the CERB. Our government took on debt to reduce the amount that Canadians themselves had to take on. We were able to do this because Canada entered this crisis on strong footing with a net debt to GDP ratio considerably lower than the rest of the G7. Our government was well positioned to be there for Canadians and lay the groundwork for our economy to bounce back. 4 months later, we've slowed down the progression of the virus significantly, and we're now seeing parts of the economy reopen. And historically low interest rates mean manageable borrowing costs as we continue to invest in Canadians and in the economy. Now, the road to recovery will not be an easy one. Some sectors will bounce back more quickly than others. Some people will be able to find work, but others won't right away. But as we move through into this recovery phase, Canadians can count on us to always be in their corner. Over the past 2 days, our team also talked about what concrete steps this government must take to fight racism and build a more inclusive Canada. Because here are the facts. Prejudice, discrimination, and violence are a lived reality for far too many Canadians. And it's the result of systems which all too often condone, normalize, perpetrate, and perpetuate inequality and injustice against racialized people. Our government pledged to work with racialized communities and Indigenous peoples to address systemic racism. Over the last 5 years, we've invested in mental health resources for Black youth and worked to close the gaps in services for Indigenous communities. And we now have Canada's anti-racism strategy, which has begun its work to change the way we do things and break down barriers. We've made progress, but it's nowhere near enough. So Cabinet has put together a work plan for the summer months. Our goal is to come up with strong policies that will help eliminate barriers facing Indigenous peoples, racialized people, and persons with disabilities. Minister Lametti is working on justice reforms. Minister Blair is focused on modernizing policing structures and updating standards regarding the use of force. Ministers Baines and Ng are looking at improving access to capital and generating more capacity. Ministers Mendicino and Qualtrough are exploring ways to ensure better protection for temporary foreign workers. And Ministers Blair and Miller are committed to co-developing a legislative framework which recognizes First Nations policing as an essential service and expand the number of communities served by First Nations policing. We have our work cut out for us, but we're ready. Fighting systemic racism, unconscious bias, and discrimination is a top priority for our government, and we will continue to listen and work with communities and allies to build a better Canada. I want to end today by congratulating Bob Rae on his appointment as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Rae has dedicated his life to serving Canada, most recently as Canada's Special Envoy on Humanitarian and Refugee Issues, and before that as Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar. In these roles, he worked closely with the UN and the international community to help lead Canada's humanitarian efforts. I know he will build on the work of Ambassador Marc-André Blanchard and defend our interests and our values with integrity. Je tiens aussi à remercier l'ambassadeur Blanchard pour ses nombreuses années de
I would also like to thank Ambassador Blanchard for his years of work. He was able to create relationships with new partners throughout his mandate. I wish him all the best in his future endeavors.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la période de questions aujourd'hui avec les journalistes dans la salle.
We're going to start today's question period with journalists in the room.
Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Last week, you told reporters that the We Charity contract awarding followed a transparent and open process. Did that include Cabinet approving the contract?
The recommendation to use We to get opportunities out for young people was made by the Public Service. But as a cabinet, we ratify those decisions. It was really important for us to give opportunities to young people, and remains important to give opportunities to young people through this pandemic to be able to engage in their communities, support local organizations, and make a difference at a time where far too many people, and particularly young people, don't have the opportunities because of this pandemic.
And did you recuse yourself from that discussion and the decision at Cabinet?
No, I did not. I have
Why not?
Long worked on youth issues, both as before I got into politics and since I've been in politics as youth critic, getting young people involved in serving their country, recognizing their desire to build a better Canada, particularly through this time of crisis, is something that I believe in deeply.
Thank you. Stephanie Lewitz, CP.
Stephanie Lewitz, the Canadian Press. Good morning. How is it that you're going to begin reshaping federal aid programs as you go ahead forward, when the reality is most parents still don't have a full-time place to put their kids at the end of the day, despite the $14 billion you've promised the province? Or do you just not see that as the Prime Minister's problem to solve?
I think as we look at creating jobs and creating economic growth across the economy, we need to know that one of the significant barriers to everyone participating is access to childcare. There are parts of this country where there is better access to childcare than others. And there is no question that our encouraging of provinces to improve access to safer childcare spaces right across the country is part of why we've set out $14 billion for the provinces. And we certainly hope that they will take that money and move forward on ensuring better childcare and safer childcare for kids across the country. It's not just about doing the right thing at a time of vulnerability. It's about growing our economy in meaningful ways and allowing people to get back to work. The federal government will use the levers that we have, respecting, of course, that it is an area of provincial jurisdiction.
And I guess maybe this will touch on what you just announced about this work plan on systemic racism. But earlier today, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said that Donald Trump had done more to directly address police brutality than your own government. And I wonder if in this work plan is going to come specific instruction to your ministers with regards to the RCMP and with regards to police brutality.
As I said, we need to end systemic racism in this country, and that includes looking carefully at what happens in our police forces and changing the protocols and ways that our police forces operate. The Minister Blair is engaged in looking specifically at that, on working with partners and ensuring that we do make substantive changes to how policing is delivered across this country, alongside many other things that need to be addressed to go at the systemic racism that exists throughout Canada, whether it's justice reform, whether it's access to capital for Black entrepreneurs, whether it's support for Indigenous businesses, whether it's ensuring that we're allowing access to childcare and support services right across the country for vulnerable communities. These are things that we as an entire government are going to be working on, because we need to take the right action in concert with vulnerable communities, working with them, listening to them, but we need to do it quickly as well, and that's what we're focused on.
Prime Minister Molly Thomas, CTV National News. The Auditor General says the CBSA has lost track of tens of thousands of people that were set for deportation. Most are rejected asylum seekers, many for criminal reasons. What is going on here, and what is the plan to fix this?
Canada has a strong immigration system, and we ensure that the rules are applied. I want to thank the Auditor General for highlighting challenges at the CBSA in ensuring that we're getting things exactly right. And we will work on the recommendations put forward. We will make sure that we're doing a better job of ensuring the integrity of our immigration system. We will be looking very closely and following the recommendations made by the Auditor General.
No plan, specifically? Prime Minister, my second question. In December, the finance minister said the estimated deficit would be $28 billion. We're looking, what we're hearing, it looks like it could be 10 times that. Do you feel the spending has gotten out of control, or are you looking at extending emergency programs?
We made a very specific and deliberate choice throughout this pandemic to help Canadians, to recognize that overnight people had lost their jobs, people had suddenly found themselves in a precarious situation and needed support. So as a federal government, given the historically low interest rates and the low debt servicing costs that we have, and given our extremely strong fiscal position going in, we decided to take on that debt to prevent Canadians from having to do it. If the federal government hadn't taken on significant debt in order to send money to Canadians to support businesses and households, what would Canadians have done? They would have loaded up their credit cards. They would have scrambled to try and find ways to pay their bills and pay their groceries and figure out how to care for their loved ones. We took on debt so Canadians wouldn't have to. And we can be confident about our position because it worked to reduce the spread of COVID-19, and we now have the spread largely under control, although we need to continue to remain vigilant. We went into this challenge with a far better fiscal position than many of our allies around the world, which allows us to come through it in a very strong way. And we know that by supporting Canadians through this pandemic, we maximize our chances of getting back on our feet as quickly as possible as an economy. I know there are people out there who said we should have done less, but I think that's wrong. Now was the time for the federal government to step up and help Canadians during a historic crisis, and that's exactly what we did. And having done that, has allowed us to get the virus more under control and is allowing us to restart the economy in a strong position, unlike many of our other allies.
Merci. On va maintenant passer au téléphone. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Moving to the phone operator, please.
Merci. Please press *1 on the telephone keypad if you have a question. Faites étoile 1 sur votre téléphone à clavier. pour des questions. La première question est de Raymond Fillon, TVA. À vous.
Merci. Bonjour, Monsieur le Premier
Thank you.
ministre. Pour
Hello,
poursuivre sur la
Mr.
même
Prime
veine que
Minister.
ma collègue Marley, on sait déjà que le
Regarding what Molly
déficit
asked,
que
we
M.
know
Morneau
that the
a annoncé
deficit
tout à
that's
l'heure
going to
sera
be
historique. Qu'est-ce que vous
announced
dites
by
aux
Mr. Morneau
Canadiens
will
qui
be
risquent de sursauter
historic.
peut-être en
What
voyant
do
ce
you have to
montant-là?
say to Canadians who
Ils
might be
s'inquiètent
shocked by
que
this amount?
le Canada vit
They may
au-dessus
be
de ses moyens
concerned
sur
that
la carte
Canada
de
is living beyond
Je
its
pense que
means with
la
its credit
première
card.
chose que les
Answer.
Canadiens doivent se
I think
rappeler,
that
c'est qu'on est
Canadians
entré dans
need
cette
to remember
pandémie
first and foremost
avec une
that
meilleure
we
position fiscale
came
que
into this
beaucoup de nos
pandemic
alliés. On avait
better
le plus
placed
bas
than a
taux
lot
de
of our
dette,
allies.
par rapport à notre
We
PIB
had
de
the
tous les
lowest
pays du G7
debt
et
to
on a pu
GDP
donc
ratio of all
investir,
G7 countries,
sans avoir
and so
trop
we were
d'impact
able
sur
to
notre stabilité
invest
fiscale.
without
En plus,
having an
il faut se
impact on
souvenir
our
que les taux d'intérêt
fiscal
sont
stability.
historiquement bas.
Also,
Et
interest
donc,
rates are at a
notre
historic
capacité
low,
de payer
and
pour
so
cette dette,
our
va être
capacity
extrêmement
to
gérable dans les
pay
années à
back
venir.
this debt will be manageable in the coming years.
Comparé à d'autres pays,
Also,
nous
compared to
sommes,
other countries,
en très bonne position
we are
de façon économique
very well placed
par rapport
economically
à la gestion de la COVID-19.
and regarding the management
On a
of
pu
COVID-19.
aider les Canadiens à
We were
rester
able
chez eux,
to help Canadians
à
stay
se
home.
protéger
We
pendant
allowed
des
them
mois
to
pour
protect
que
themselves for
maintenant,
months
on a le virus
so that
sous contrôle.
now we have the virus under
Continuer à
control.
demeurer vigilant. Il va
We
falloir
need to
empêcher
stay
cette,
vigilant, of course.
deuxième ou d'autres
We need
vagues.
to
Mais
stop
nous
a
avons
potential
fait ce qu'on avait
second wave.
besoin de faire pour
We did
permettre
what
aux
we needed to
Canadiens
do in order
de
to
reprendre le
allow
contrôle
Canadians
et maintenant de relancer
to
l'économie tranquillement.
restart the economy
Mais il faut aussi
gradually.
se poser la question.
But we
Si
also
on
need to
n'avait
ask
pas
ourselves a question.
investi
Had
pour
we
aider les
not
Canadiens,
invested to help
qu'est-ce que les
Canadians,
Canadiens auraient fait?
what would Canadians have done?
Ils auraient mis énormément plus de dépenses sur leur carte
They
de
would have
crédit.
had to put a lot of spending on their credit cards. They would have had to remortgage their houses. A lot of companies would have had to
Et le fait
close
que,
their
au
doors
fédéral,
forever.
on a le coût d'emprunt le plus bas de tous les autres paliers de gouvernement, de tous
At
les
the federal
Canadiens,
level,
nous permet
we
de
have
savoir qu'on
a
est en
low
train de faire la
rate
bonne
of
chose et
borrowing,
notre
and we know
économie
that we're
va
doing
bien
the right
rebondir.
thing and that our economy will be able to bounce back. Follow-up question, Raymond.
Ceci dit, comment vous comptez
That
vous y
said,
prendre pour payer la note
how
la cote de crédit du Canada récemment
are
a
you
été
going
abaissée
to
par une agence internationale.
pay for
Est-ce que
this?
vous excluez des hausses de
Our
taxes,
credit
d'impôts,
rating
un report de
decreased. Are
certaines
you
promesses électorales?
going
Quel
to
est votre plan?
increase
Je pense
taxes?
qu'il faut
What's your
savoir
plan?
que d'augmenter les impôts,
To
augmenter les taxes sur les impôts,
increase
de couper dans les
taxes
services,
or
serait la
cutting in
pire
services?
chose à faire maintenant.
These would be the
On va
worst
pas
options.
ajouter des dépenses et freiner la
We don't
relance
want to
économique. On va
continue
pas
spending
limiter
and
l'aide
slow the
qu'on doit
economic
offrir aux
restart. We're not
Canadiens.
going to limit the
On doit
help
créer des emplois,
that we
on
need to
doit
give
créer
to
de la
Canadians.
croissance
We need to
économique.
create
C'est
jobs. We need to
exactement ce
create
qu'on va
economic
faire.
growth.
Mais il
And that
faut
is
se
exactly what we're
souvenir,
going to do.
qu'on est
But
dans une situation
we also need to
semblable que bien
remember
d'autres pays, dans une situation
that
bien
we're
meilleure que bien d'autres pays.
facing this situation like other countries, but we're better off than some of those countries. All of these countries had to invest to help their country, but Canada came into this stronger than other countries. We were also able to better control the virus than our allies, specifically our neighbor. So this allows us to restart our economy more quickly and more successfully than others who are still struggling actively with this virus. We are doing the right thing to help Canadians, and because of this, our economy will be able to restart more quickly and more strongly than a lot of our allies.
Thank you. Operator, next question over the phone.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Rosemary Barton, CBC. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Thanks for taking our questions. I know today we're going to hear more about the state of the economy in terms of the decisions you've already taken. But I'm interested in knowing more about what decisions you have yet to take in terms of the recovery. Can you explain to Canadians why the recovery and stimulus that might be needed on the other side of this is going to be different, or how it will be different than it was during the last recession, please?
Well, I think obviously this recession is very different from the last recession. The challenges our economy are facing are linked to a public health emergency, a pandemic that has very, very different impacts on the economy than previous challenges faced over the past decades. That's why we're very much focused on holding things in place, on supporting Canadians so that they can make it through and protect their loved ones and protect our frontline workers and protect our vulnerable populations by giving them the support they need over these past months. That's what we chose to do. We're beginning to see the economy restart. And before we get into the full recovery and how we build back better, we need to make sure we are managing through the transition towards restarting. There are many Canadians getting back to work these weeks. There are many others who are still in a position where they can't find jobs. That's what we're very much focused on right now, because we're still very much in an urgent phase of this pandemic and this crisis.
Following up, Rosie?
Well, if I can just follow up. One of the things that the pandemic has done, obviously, is expose the most vulnerable in our society and the broad inequities that exist. How do you think the economy will look different in order to address some of those vulnerabilities and help those who have been most hurt by this?
I think there are going to be really important discussions and indeed political debates about that and about what our economy looks like for the coming years in the coming months. But I can tell you that from the very beginning, we focused on helping all Canadians with a particular focus on the most vulnerable Canadians. Canadians who didn't have access to EI and lost their jobs. Canadians who need to rely on shelters, whether it's people fleeing domestic violence, which was increased by the need to stay home, or people who are already living in the streets. We needed to increase our support for food banks. We need to make sure that Indigenous communities that are so vulnerable to health crises because of a lack of health system supports were extra protected. Throughout this pandemic, even as we sent out support to more than 11 million Canadians, we had a specific focus on the most vulnerable. Because that's just who we are as Canadians, but also because we know that allowing and encouraging and giving the ability of everyone to participate, of reducing barriers as we move forward is going to be extremely important. And I look forward to those discussions. Right now, we're still very much focused on helping people through this crisis.
Thank you. We'll take one last question on the floor.
Busy day domestically, of course, but down in D.C., we have the U.S. President Donald Trump, Mexican counterpart, having a meeting. You spoke to the Mexican president this week. Do you have plans to speak to Donald Trump after this meeting, and will you be discussing aluminum tariffs with him?
I speak reasonably regularly and have over the past many years with the U.S. president, and look forward to congratulating him and all of us on the coming into force of the new NAFTA, the USMCA. I think it's really important that at a time of economic strain and stress, we continue to have access to the world's most important market. And this is good for Canadian workers and Canadian jobs right across the country.
I wonder if I could just ask you to...
At the same time, we are concerned about the threat of extra tariffs on aluminum and possibly steel. This is something that, again, is a little bit difficult to understand, because the United States relies heavily on imports of Canadian aluminum in particular for their domestic manufacturing capacity. The U.S. doesn't make nearly enough aluminum to be able to cover its needs, particularly at a time where we want the economies to get going again across North America. So what tariffs would do would be to raise prices for manufacturers in the United States and put extra stress on them at a time where the stresses abound, which is why we are continuing to push very hard on encouraging the U.S. to not move forward on tariffs that we don't think have any justification and will have negative impacts.
I wonder if I could just ask you to repeat in French the answer you gave to Rosie about what you're thinking about going forward in terms of what these programs may or may not look like.
Depuis les tout débuts,
From the beginning,
nous savions que nous devions aider les Canadiens,
we knew that we had to help Canadians,
les Canadiens les plus vulnérables.
specifically vulnerable Canadians.
L'aide qu'on a
That's
envoyée,
why,
11 millions
from
de
the
Canadiens,
start,
plus qu'11 millions de Canadiens, par la
we
PCU
helped
et par
11 million
l'assurance
Canadians
salariale,
through the
a
CERB
été,
and the wage
concentrée
subsidy.
sur les plus vulnérables,
We
mais
focused
aussi,
on the
on a
most
aidé
vulnerable,
les banques alimentaires,
but we also helped
les,
food
les
banks.
refuges, pour,
We helped
pour,
shelters
victimes de violences domestiques,
for
des
victims
aides pour les
of
communautés
domestic
autochtones.
violence. There was
On sait que
assistance
pendant
for
cette
Indigenous
crise,
communities.
pendant toute crise, malheureusement,
We know
les
that
plus vulnérables, ont
during
toujours
any
les plus
crisis,
grands impacts. Et
the
donc,
most vulnerable
nous
are
devions
those
de
that
prêter attention à eux. Et c'est ce
feel
qu'on a
the
fait.
impact
Dans
the
les
most,
mois,
and we
et les
wanted to
années à
take
venir,
care
sûrement
of
qu'il va y avoir
these
énormément de
most
discussions, de
vulnerable.
débats politiques
There
sur
will be
comment
discussions,
on relance et
political
comment on
debates
rebâtit une
on
économie plus
how
forte pour les
to
Canadiens. Mais je peux vous
restart
dire
the economy
que
so that
l'aide
it
aux
is
plus
stronger for
vulnérables
Canadians.
sera toujours
But I
au
have to
cœur
say
de ce
that
qu'on
the
va
heart,
faire,
or at
parce
the heart
que
of what we are
la
going to
meilleure
do,
façon de
we
créer
will
la
always
croissance, c'est de
have
s'assurer que
the
tout
most
le monde
vulnerable
puisse
Canadians in mind.
participer pleinement,
We want
qu'on réduise
everyone
les
to
barrières
be able
à
to
la
participate
participation
fully to the
économique,
economy. We
qu'on
want to reduce
réduise
barriers,
les inéquités qui existent
and
à
we want
l'intérieur de nos
to
systèmes.
eliminate
Nous allons toujours faire plus
these
pour les
barriers
Canadiens
in our
vulnérables
system.
parce que c'est la
We will
bonne
always
chose à
do more
faire,
for vulnerable
mais aussi
Canadians
parce que
because
c'est
it
la
is the
chose
right thing to do,
intelligente à faire
but also
pour
because it
créer
is
les
the smart
emplois
thing
et
to
la
do
croissance économique.
in order to create jobs and economic growth. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. This concludes today's press conference.
The Prime Minister holding a news conference in Ottawa. The Prime Minister holding a news conference in Ottawa and taking questions from reporters. We know today is a big day for numbers because we're going to get an economic snapshot, a fiscal snapshot, if you will, of where Canada stands after having spent so much to keep this pandemic at bay and help Canadians across the country. And Trudeau saying that Canadians may be shocked by the number, or if they are shocked by the number, know that that spending has allowed the government to keep the virus under control. The Prime Minister is saying the government did what it needed to do. CBC's Janice McGregor has also been listening along, and she joins me live from our nation's capital. Many questions there, Janice, but today, again, as we prepare to focus